I do solemnly swear to every living being and every living soul, now cometh the age of the stars.
How's it going, everyone? My name's Iron Stark, and today I'll be showing a build centered around the Carian Sorcery Sword, the only new thrusting sword introduced in the Shadow of Uratree DLC, as well as Elden Ring's only weapon casting tool. To begin, the Carian Sorcery Sword shares the same light attack chain as other thrusting swords, but what makes it so unique is that its heavy attack is replaced with the ability to cast sorceries. This provides the Carian Sorcery Sword with the versatility to combo melee and ranged attacks seamlessly in a way that is very satisfying to pull off. Before I sell you all on the versatility of this weapon, I will talk about its drawbacks. As a thrusting sword, the Carian Sorcery Sword is objectively among the worst thrusting swords in the game if we're only measuring it as a weapon. Every infusible thrusting sword in the game will outperform it in terms of raw damage when set to the Magic Affinity by at least 8 attack rating with the Rapier, and as much as 58 with the Cleanrot Knight's sword when at 80 intelligence. Additionally, the Carian Sorcery Sword is locked with Impaling Thrust as its weapon skill, despite being upgraded with regular smithing stones, meaning any other magic thrusting sword would have much more options in terms of weapon skills. As a unique intelligence weapon with a fixed weapon skill, this is also not all that great, because it shares the same category as the Wing of Astel, Dark Moon Greatsword, and Moonveil, which are all objectively among the best weapons in the game. As a Glintstone staff, the Carian Sorcery Sword is also objectively among the worst in the game. For a pure intelligence build at 80 intelligence, the only staff it will outperform is the Meteorite Staff, which can't even be upgraded. Also, for whatever reason, the Carian Sorcery Sword performs horribly with any sorcery that doesn't do magic damage, as demonstrated here with the footage using Blade of Stone. Notice how terrible the damage is when casting with the Carian Sorcery Sword when compared to casting with the Carian Regal Scepter. I suspect this is a bug because this can't be an intentional feature, so I'm going to ask from buff this weapon. Again, it is criminal that a weapon this fun to use is this bad on paper. Alright, so, roasting this weapon aside, why would someone use this weapon? Because the Carian Sorcery Sword is clearly not the next best intelligence weapon or reshaping the meta of PvE in any way, shape, or form. The answer is simple: convenience and on-the-fly versatility. When using the Carian Sorcery Sword, I can powerstance, I can parry and critical attack. I can melee if an enemy is closing the distance on me. I can cast a spell without needing to switch to a different weapon. And while the lack of a heavy attack is disappointing, Impaling Thrust can act as the weapon's heavy attack, or any sorcery I cast is likely going to hit harder than any thrusting sword heavy attack anyway. In some ways, this weapon truly is an intelligence weapon, because it actually forces the player to think in creative ways to use it. As for the weapon itself, the Carian Sorcery Sword is considered a pure intelligence weapon, with an S scaling in intelligence and lousy scaling with any other stat. For this build, I powerstance it with a Magic Affinity Estoc in my left hand to allow for powerstance combos, and I also use the Rift Shield with Carian Retaliation for parrying. This build uses 2 main offensive weapon skills. First, the Carian Sorcery Sword's fixed skill is Impaling Thrust, a lunging pierce attack where the player closes the distance and stabs at the enemy. It deals 24 stance damage on a thrusting sword, which is decent. I often pair this skill with the sorcery Greatblade Phalanx, which can do 30 stance damage if all the swords connect. The second skill this build uses is Carian Sovereignty on the Estoc, where the player summons a massive magic sword that slams down on an opponent and can have a follow-up. It deals a very respectable raw and stance damage, but I only use it sparingly with this build as to focus more on the Carian Sorcery Sword. For defense, this build uses Carian Retaliation to parry both melee and ranged attacks very effectively. The main strategies of this build are eclectic. I rely on the swift attacks of the thrusting sword Powerstance to burst bosses down, can use sorceries effectively at a distance, or use them to stance break or inflict Frostbite, or I can play more defensively and parry into a critical attack, which could then provide a big opening for some of my longer casts. For sorceries, this build can effectively cycle through any magic damage sorcery in the game. I'm only going to cover the ones I consider to be essential to this build, as I use a ton of sorceries in this video. As I mentioned before, the Carian Sorcery Sword does not have high sorcery scaling. At 80 intelligence, it only has 291 sorcery scaling. To work around this, the best sorceries to use when building around the Carian Sorcery Sword are those that either provide good stance damage that synergize with Impaling Thrust, or deal Frostbite, so they don't need to rely on high raw damage, or ones that act as natural melee extensions to make up for Thrusting Sword's weaknesses. I already mentioned how Greatblade Phalanx is a natural go-to sorcery for stance damage, as it deals 30 stance damage if all the Great Blades connect. Shard Spiral acts as a solid sorcery for this build for melting large targets, because it does damage for every tick it spends drilling through a boss. Zaymor Ice Storm deals 80 Frostbite per tick, and can shred boss health pools apart very quickly. Carian Sword sorceries, such as Carian Slicer, Carian Piercer, and Adula's Moonblade, all feel like natural additions to the Carian Sorcery Sword's moveset, and can feel like a proper heavy attack. And most importantly, Ranni's Dark Moon is pretty essential to this build, as it debuffs enemy magic negation by 20% for a minute, and deals 270 Frostbite. The debuff effect of the Dark Moon goes a long way in making this weapon a lot more viable. The primary stats for this build are Intelligence at 80 for weapon and sorcery scaling, Dexterity at 19 to meet the Carian Sorcery Sword's requirements, Mind at 34 because this build is very FP intensive between its sorcery and weapon skill use, and Endurance at 30, mainly for aggression as one of its playstyles is successive hits. If there's any stat that you could cut back from, it would definitely be Endurance. The armor is mostly for aesthetics, to fit the archetype of a magical knight, with the Oathseeker's helm, Rellana's armor, Black Knight gauntlets, and Royal Knight greaves. This setup also has more than 51 poise, which is always useful for a build that casts. For talismans, this build uses those that foster a blade and spell playstyle. Magic Scorpion is always locked in to increase magic damage by 12% while taking a decrease to physical damage negation by 10%. Radahn Icon is a natural choice, as it increases casting speed by adding 30 virtual dexterity. On slower casting spells, this definitely comes in handy to make sure that you can get your spells off safely. Rotten Wingsword Insignia acts as a successive hit buff and can be double up upon with the use of Millicent's prosthesis. This approach should be taken if you intend to fight mostly with both thrusting swords and rely less on casting. Alternatively, the final talisman slot can be occupied by the Graven Mass Talisman to increase the power of sorceries by 8%. If you plan on leaning more heavily into casting, or going against a boss that you know that is going to be at range, you should put this talisman in for your last slot. For buffs and physic, this build only uses one Wondrous Physic setup with these two tiers. The Magic Shrouding Cracked tier to increase magic damage by 20% for 3 minutes, and the Thorny Cracked tier to act as an additional successive hit buff. This is the power of the Carian Sorcery Sword and Magic Estoc with only the Magic Scorpion charm. This is the power of the Carian Sorcery Sword and Magic Estoc with the Magic Scorpion charm and Magic Shrouding Cracked Tier. This is the power of the Carian Sorcery Sword and Magic Estoc with only the Magic Scorpion charm and at Shadow level 20. This is the power of the Carian Sorcery Sword and Magic Estoc with the Magic Shrouding Cracked Tier and Magic Scorpion charm at Shadow level 20. Most of the footage for this video was captured during the 1.12.3 patch, with all DLC bosses after Rolana being fought in the 1.13 patch. Glintblade Trio and Glintstone Nails were specifically buffed in that patch. As always, enjoy the showcase.
shall not be forgiven. extraordinary. The mark of a true lord.
Thy strength befits a crown.
your foolishness!